I was going to reassure the honourable member for Stirling, who is no longer in his place, that I can do nothing other, given the lateness of the hour, than be reasonable and mild-mannered in my presentation tonight. He seems fearful of that we might be going berserk in these benches and concerned that we put our case with too much passion. But let me try and put this as reasonably as I can. I also want to agree with others who have talked about the cross-party positive nature of what's happening here. We have three different parties on this side of the House who differ quite significantly on their preferred constitutional outcome and endgame for Scotland, but we are united in trying to defend the gains of devolution made over the last 20 years. Indeed, I think some of the Scottish Tories possibly feel that way too from the discussions that we've had in the Scottish Affairs Select Committee, although they seem too timorous to be able to exercise that conviction by going through the lobbies with us tonight. But perhaps they will be persuaded in the fullness of time. By way of context in this debate, I think we need to remember two things. One is the interplay between the referenda of 2014 and 2016 in Scotland and how that affects this debate. I was on the losing side in 2014. I lost the Scottish independence referendum campaign, and I accept the result. But I think it is important in understanding that Scotland has voted to remain in the United Kingdom to look at some of the assurances that were given by the people who won that campaign in terms of how they affect this debate. And I'm not going to talk about the obvious one, which was what was said about EU membership itself, but about two other things. One was all parties who argued for a no vote in that referendum went out of their way to stress that there was no threat to the devolution settlement and that they would defend and extend it. The other thing that was said and given as an assurance was to say that this was not a matter, should Scotland vote to remain in a political union with England, Wales and Northern Ireland, of a country being subsumed by a much larger neighbour, but this was the creation of a partnership of equals, a multinational but yet unitary state. And therefore the views of Scotland would be respected in any debates that would take place in the future. So I am calling to collect now in terms of both respect and commitment to devolution from this government. Because as far as I can see Clause 11 written at the minute, it respects neither of those things. And I find it quite regrettable that at this relatively advanced stage in discussion on this bill, that we still don't have any agreement whatsoever in some of the basic things. The other thing that we need to remember by way of context, of course, is the debate about devolution itself. I was involved heavily in the campaign that led to the creation of the Scottish Parliament and arguing for yes, yes in 1997, but I wasn't here when members debated in 1998 the Scotland Bill. But I observed it, and we can read the transcripts, and we know quite clearly, led by the late Donald Dewar, that the Parliament took a maximalist position. It basically said that everything should be devolved unless there is a case for it not being so, and that's why the Scotland Act doesn't list the powers that are devolved, it lists the powers that are to be reserved. And I say this to colleagues, that if we hadn't been in the European Union in 1998 when discussing that Scotland Bill, how many of these 111 areas of responsibility would have been reserved and how many would have been devolved to the Scottish Government? The truth is that practically all of them would have been devolved without question, because there is no compelling case set against that debate for their reservation. Now, I think people are misunderstanding the nature of the debate when they talk about the transfer of competence from the EU to the UK following Brexit. Let us be quite clear. The reason why the European Union currently has some legislative competence in the devolved areas is in order to ensure compliance with the Treaty of the European Union. That is what it is about. If Brexit goes ahead and we come out of the European Union, then de facto that will not be required. So whatever the UK government does with it takes these areas of competence on, it won't be about complying with the terms of the Treaty of the European Union. The only thing it can be about, given we already have a single economy in the United Kingdom, is convergence on policy. So we therefore see in this transfer the possibility that we move from compliance with international agreements to compliance with domestic policy. And that is what I mean by a power grab, because that represents a severe potential constraint upon the ability of the Scottish Parliament to legislate and act in its devolved areas. Now, ministers will say that's not the intention. that all we're trying to do here, this is a drop-off point for these powers in order that we can then decide the best way that they should go to their final resting place. Well, I have to say to ministers, we are politicians, not psychics. We have to deal with what is written in front of us. We have to deal with the bill that you have brought before us, not with your intentions of what it might be as you go towards your endgame. And what is written in this bill is most clearly not what is being argued for by the front bench. If it were, then we would simply have a schedule by now that said which of these 111 powers can go straight to the devolved authorities on exit day, which definitely need to be reserved within the context of the 1998 Act, and which need further exploration, and we'll have some sort of process for doing that. Not a single one. And I say to ministers that even from your own public relations point of view, would it not have been sensible to at least chuck a few of these powers the way of the devolved administrations? Number 9 in that list is about blood safety. What is it with the Scottish Health Service and the Scottish Blood Transfusion Service that you don't trust? Why on earth would blood safety need to be reserved to the UK? Energy efficiency is another one. Is it the end of the world if in Scotland we pioneer some aspects of efficient energy use and perhaps lead the way in the UK? Why can that be a threat to the Union? Why does that require the ministers to keep those powers? There are other things in here which illustrate the ridiculousness, I think, of arguing that we should even have a temporary drop-off with these powers at Westminster. There are things that should quite clearly go to the devolved administration. So I'm left wondering why is it then that this is being done? And the obvious first answer I think of, well, it's just because there's a phenomenal degree of administrative competence involved here. I think there is malintent by some members in the party opposite, but probably not by the front bench. But I think they have got themselves into a situation where, because they have been unable and incapable of coming forward with a plan, they simply have no other option but to say, trust us for now, we'll do the best thing in the end. And it is very difficult for this Parliament to accept those assurances. But I think there's another red herring that's been said here, and that is that the reason why these powers need to be retained and examined further is because somehow they might interfere with the ability of the United Kingdom to strut the post-Brexit globe in its ambition for Empire 2.0, that somehow there's a fearfulness that the people in Scotland or Wales might act up like the Walloonians and try and frustrate the creation of an international trade agreement. Well, how ridiculous is that? Does it really matter if in Scotland, for example, the Scottish Government took a policy that said we don't wish to have genetically modified food in our food chain? Why is that a threat to an international trade agreement? All that needs to be done is to simply specify that in Scotland, that's what you need to deal with. And anybody wishing to sign that agreement would be quite reasonably able to do so. The only way it could become a threat to future post-Brexit deals is if we were arguing, or there was a suggestion, that the Scottish Government and the Welsh Assembly should take to themselves a power to veto a future UK international trade agreement, and no such power is being discussed. So it seems to me ridiculous that we should not by now be discussing which powers are going where, rather than the fact that there is nothing that can be done apart from a power grab by the Westminster Government. I finally wanted to say, Dame Rosie, on frameworks, on common frameworks. The way in which the frameworks that we need for these 111 areas are going to be entirely different, depending on the area. In some cases, it might just be a simple matter of the agencies north and south of the border talking to each other and sharing best practice. There are probably very few areas which actually require a full-blown statutory regulatory framework across the United Kingdom. They're nodding their heads. If that's the case, then why have you not identified them? Why not bring forward the proposals for dealing with these joint arrangements? And the fact that that's not been done, you see, I don't attribute malintent to the front bench, but there are people. There are people within the Conservative Party. I see the Scottish Tories have gone home, but there are people with. Oh, sorry, they've left the honourable member from Gordon in as a lone representative. Two of you. I withdraw the remark. 80% of you have gone home. Anyway, So they have talked about the process that we're engaged in here. We're engaged in the process of considering amendments and changes to legislation. And I say to the Scottish Conservatives, they should think again about going through the lobby with the government tonight, because if they do so, they will give the government succour rather than put pressure on it to come forward and make these agreements and make these changes. And if that happens, then that will provide sustenance to those people in the benches opposite who never believed in devolution in the first place and will use Brexit as an opportunity to roll it back and take power to the centre.